Hello, and welcome to another installment of Profiles in Tacticalness. So today, we're going to be talking about everyone's favorite and/or least favorite scrappy underdog with the weird stats from the entire series, the Terror Knight. So, this guy has kind of been up and down throughout the entire series in some pretty bizarre ways. Well, I say guy, but there's a gal in there too. But alright, so starting off over back in Ogre Battle, this was actually a guy that evolved out of the Berserker. Oddly enough, despite being called the Terror Knight, he actually evolved out of the Berserker or the Wizard instead of the actual Knight. You'd think a Knight with low alignment would turn into this guy, not so much. So at that point, they actually didn't have their whole morale mechanic going for them, as far as I'm aware. They actually just were basically a caster knight. So in the front, they got a couple of attacks. In the back, they got a couple of casts. They were pretty competent in what they did, and they had pretty decent overall stats, I would say. Um, they got for some reason they got very rounded once they got to Ogre Battle 64. But weirdly enough, they had a little bit of a niche to fill, but they ended up changing roles about halfway through the series. So basically, the role of Caster Knight was taken over by Valkyries and Warlocks. So they became the morale guy. So once the SNES version of Let Us Cling Together rolled around, their whole ability was essentially changed to a sort of area of effect around them at all times that would scare anybody nearby them. So this was very good as far as abilities go, but their stats were god awful, and quite frankly, they couldn't really do a whole lot aside from just stand there and give that debuff. So, by and large, they just tended to get killed off by archers and mages, as many frontline units did, seeing as, even knights with their tankiness were not exactly enough to survive that sort of thing. Funnily enough, despite the fact that Terror Knights don't really make an appearance in Knight of Lotus, their ability is actually still there. So technically speaking, in many ways, in Knight of Lotus, the Terror Knight is the best. Simply by the fact that it doesn't show up and anybody can be a Terror Knight. So the logo on the right side there, that is the Blood Rain emblem. Essentially, you get that for 25 kills, and yeah, that can go on any unit. It will give a permanent negative effect on the morale of anybody that's around. And if you go and you stack that up with your own, positive morale affecting emblems, you could have a unit that's just overpowered by default. It's pretty great. Now, once they got to Lucht, they once again had a little bit of a weird change, because they still retained that same fear ability, that same AoE fear ability. However, they didn't actually get that ability until they got into their 20s. So up until then, they were essentially a kind of very, very, very slow frontline caster tank sort of situation. However, they weren't very good at casting, they weren't very good at tanking, and their selection of equipment was odd to say the least. Um, it seems like most of the two-handed equipment was actually given to them for the sake of speed, since a sword and board type build would actually slow them down a little bit more. They were sort of okay with hammers. They were passable with two-handed swords. Actually, the lighter weight of the two-handed swords was something that kind of kept them going a little bit. But it's funny because arguably their best loadout was actually a crossbow. So, for example, if you had them in heavy armor and a crossbow, essentially you could keep them out of the front lines that they're supposed to be participating in, and essentially you can make use of some of their other abilities. Now, despite the fact that they had access to a whole lot of casting abilities, a lot of their debuffs had a very low chance of hitting. We're talking like 10 to 15% chance, and this is even after you've gotten them equipped in Balder and all that sort of thing. They had this little window. Well, they had two little windows throughout the game when they were actually useful. Once you got, well, I guess very early on, once nothing has resistance, it's arguable that they could be useful at that point. But around the point where Baldur equipment becomes available, if you deck them out in a full set of that, they'll usually get enough of an int bonus to be able to be passable. If you had a character with really high base stats to begin with, you could probably work some stuff out with that. And then once you got to the very end, once you got access to like the ogre set and the headsman and all that sort of thing, at that point, yes, you had a character that could be pretty good, but given the amount of effort that it took to actually make them good, it's arguable that it wasn't worthwhile. The whole health stealing ability, That's actually one of the spells they can use. They can arguably use it pretty well. But again, if you try to use any generic unit as a Terra Knight, they are going to be garbage without a ton of investment. For example, if you make Denim into one, he can usually be okay in the role. If you take one of the sisters, they're usually going to be pretty okay in that role. But overall, it was just subpar. The ability to get a guaranteed hit that inflicted fear, that was very useful. But again, their overall slowness made it so that you actually couldn't make a whole lot of use of a lot of their abilities. So then, of course, one vision rolls around and makes everything amazing. So now we're going to go ahead and switch over to that. So they're basically everything about their role has been made better. So if we take a quick peek at this here, let's get this paint dealy out of the way. So here we have Gatalio and the Danger Zone team from before. So if we take a quick peek here, their weapon selection hasn't changed much. However, their two-handed equipment has basically become their default. They can't equip any one-handed weapons at all. They lost access to crossbows, but they have two-handed spears, or not spears, I apologize. They have swords, axes, hammers, as well as cudgels. Now you might be saying, okay, I remember base game cudgels. They were pretty awful. And you'd be very true. Very true on that. So, base game cudgels actually did not get any proper attack stats, or at least not a decent amount of them, I should say. So, if you were trying to use a cudgel build, odds are you were using it for the int bonus. In their case, it usually wasn't worthwhile. Usually, the idea would have been if you have them set up in a situation where they'd essentially go and repeatedly keep sapping health. If you had them running around sapping health and sapping TP, it could be useful for that, but again, it's a very specific role to be putting them into. There's many better ways to be handling that situation. Especially if you're having a TP removing ability, something like Brimstone is going to do that job a fair bit better. If we're talking base game, anyway. So, essentially, the way that they've changed, cudgels actually have both a magical variant and a combat variant. Both of them actually can do respectable damage, so it's actually worthwhile to give them cudgels. They still get some pretty good kill moves out of it. All three of their main weapons, though, the two-handed swords, axes, and hammers, have options to scale up with TP, so you can potentially get some excellent damage out of that. They still have Fearful Impact. That one hasn't changed, although its cost has been altered a little bit. You have Shadow Break. Now, this used to be completely worthless before. Both Shadow Break and Squash were very, very specific variants of the same ability. So, for example, Squash was something like if you run into a jack-o'-lantern, you can step on it. Or Shadow Break is if there's a shadow in your way, and it was never worth the slot. So Shadow Break here essentially explodes a shadow instead. So for example, if there is a rampart shadow that a knight just dropped, you can run up, blow it up, and it will essentially count as hitting each of them with whatever weapon you have equipped. So if he's got a two-handed hammer or something like that, he explodes the clone. He will hit every tile around that particular shadow with his weapon. It's fantastic. So you have Demon's Pact, you gotta have your recruit ability, but you end up getting this much earlier, so you can actually get an Umbra now. That was something that was very frustrating in base game because you saw these Umbra units absolutely everywhere. You're like, oh, look, these demonic guys look pretty cool. It would be great if I could hire one, and then you usually ended up getting one so late in the game that you really didn't want to bother leveling them up. It was an odd place that they put them. So you can get them by level 5 now. You can actually get to see what their classes look like. I kid you not, it took me, I want to say, 5 years of playing the game before I ever even figured out how to recruit one. So it was a hot minute. And then you have Lament of the Dead, which is no longer a ranked ability, so you don't have to rank this up anymore. I believe it's just 60% from the very get-go. Originally, if you had somebody with a headsman, you would essentially be able to get a 100% chance off that relatively early. But again, it was a ranking ability that took a hot minute to get up there. It was always one of their better abilities, but at this point, TP40, RT20, it's pretty good. It's pretty good. You got Reflect Magic on them, Absorb MP, Tactician. You've got your TP raising abilities here. They get half access to items. They don't get the ability to throw them. They get Steadfast and Siege. They get all of their usual wards and all of that. Stuff like Clarity and Efficacy can be very useful on them if you're going for a caster type setup. They get higher ranks than the Knights did. Actually, no, I believe they get the same ranks than the Knights did. Actually, something like Absorb MP might serve them a little bit better because they have a tendency to be a little bit lower on resistance sometimes. But alright, so there we go. That is a general rundown of their skills. Equipment-wise, like I said, all of their access is to heavy armors and heavy weapons. So yeah, without any further ado, let's go ahead and get going here. So this is going to be a little bit jarring if you've never played One Vision and you've only played the original game, because again, they are no longer made of paper. They are pretty darn fantastic here, I have to say. So that was kind of the base game issue with these guys. They would essentially, their armor was too low, their speed was too low, and they had a whole lot of abilities that they were not really equipped to actually use out of the box. Now, don't get me wrong, like I said, if you have a character that had very strong stats, if you had somebody that you were going and training through multiple classes and all of that sort of thing, you could make them good. But the thing was, it really was not worth the time investment. It took a very long time to make that happen. And even once you got to that point, usually in order to get the most out of their abilities, you had to go and hunt down very specific pieces of rare equipment. It just wasn't a good time. So in this case, the way that I have all of these, you know what, I probably should have showed you how we have all of these set up here. So alright, let's go ahead and go to the menu here. So they're equipped in a bunch of different ways here. We've got a strength build for the axes, we've got a sort of skill build for the swords, we've got a defensive setup for the hammers, and then we've got a sort of accuracy slash casting setup for the cudgels. So, like I mentioned before, they do still have a fair bit of armor options. They still have their evasive setup if you want them to be that way. Personally, I like having my TKs very tanky, but there are definitely options that work out for them. Something, for example, like the hammers and dynamo plate ends up working pretty well. Essentially, you just get a little bit more out of your weapons there. So these guys are in many ways both a counter and a very effective pairing to knights. So with knights, as you saw last time, they would essentially be able to put down rampart shadows and or well phalanxes in this game. They would be able to go and put them down all along the front line. Now, as far as knights go, once enemy units end up getting entangled in them, you know, they can trap them in there. They can get them a little bit stuck. But overall, you know, that aside from fighting them directly, they may not necessarily have a means of handling them at that point. They can essentially hold them in place. That's what knights do best. So at that point, that's when you bring in the TKs. Now, personally, I really like a setup of, for example, 2 or 3 knights and then 2 Terror Knights backing them up, because essentially what they can do, they can all fight together in the same line. The knights would be able to drop the phalanxes, and they'd be able to trap several units in there. Then the TKs can run in, they can get a hit on somebody, and they've actually got a pretty reasonable range on their Shadow Break ability. So they would be able to run up and essentially blow those things up. So they'd be able to hit potentially up to 5 units in one move. So that can be very strong depending on how you use it. As you can see, you get 3 range on this. It's 2 range on the phalanx. So for example, let's say, you know, this one ran up and ended up hitting this one, then they ended up, like, let's say if this one was a knight. They would be able to drop a phalanx over here, so this one would be able to go get a hit off on this one, then they would be able to hit them again using their free move to blow up the phalanx from over on this side. So, it's very useful. It does get rid of the phalanx, but again, it's pretty fantastic damage that you're getting out of it. Due to the fact that they have a lot of heavy weapons, this tends to give them a ton of extra damage. It also should be noted that with Shadow Break, their abilities are 100%. And here we go, 60% out of the box for Lament of the Dead. So, Lament of the Dead will reduce all of their stats by 20%. Usually this ends up reducing their effective attack and defense by much more than 20%. But either way, statistically speaking, that's what that's all about. Now, the main 2 drawbacks for Terror Knights that you may already have noticed several times in this is the fact that they're very slow, first of all. Well, Yeah, they're pretty much tied with knights as far as overall slowness. I mean, they are a heavy armor tank. Now that they actually have armor, they can actually have some health on them. They can actually have some tankiness to them. But point being, they are an effective frontliner. They're pretty slow, but they are relatively inaccurate. Now, if you use stuff like two-handed swords, you're going to get a fair bit of extra accuracy out of that. Bear in mind, there's two schools of thought to this, though. If you've got your basic two-handed swords, you can essentially get pretty consistent damage throughout the entire fight. However, and I don't know if Gatalia is the one to show this. Let me see here. I think it was this last one here. Now, was the stasis blade the one I'm looking at? Yes. So, you've also got heavy variants of those two-handed weapons. So essentially, if I go over here to this guy, right? Or not this one. If we go to the Terminus S tier, this used to be the headsman. Uh, Essentially, you'll see it has an agility bonus. It will essentially give you a little bit of extra accuracy, um, in to the tune of about 34%, give or take. Now, the thing is, these other swords here, they are the heavy variants. Now, you can get a lot of extra damage out of these, but you essentially have to turn on Fearful Impact to have a reasonable chance of hitting with them. So, like right here, obviously this is a rogue, so they're not going to end up being terribly accurate. But this is a almost maxed evasive setup, so they've got an evasive shield, an evasive vest, an evasive helmet, and a ring of evasion. On a rogue, the only thing they're missing is the evasive fist weapon. But even then, he still had 55%, so that's pretty reasonable for his situation there. Now, is this the one I want? Unfortunately, no, it is not. I was hoping one of these sword guys would move next for the sake of comparison. Now, most of those heavy sword guys will have about a 25% chance to hit. Again, they are intentionally using a super heavy weapon, because the Terranite is one of the few classes that can actually make very effective use of the heavy two-handed variant. So here we go. If you want consistent accuracy, again, just standard two-hander, or actually stabs can be pretty good if you give them a ring of alacrity. Is this the one? No. This is another axe guy. That's fine. That's fine. As you can see, their damage is pretty hard for these guys to follow up with. This guy actually has Dragon Slayer on him as well from his equipment. Some of them will get that ability. It just depends on how you equip them. Essentially, if you give two pieces of Dragon Scale armor, whichever kinds you end up using, you will be able to get Dragon Slayer on just about anyone. Now, really, aside from that, there's not a whole lot of actual downsides to using these guys. Again, Rings of Alacrity probably going to be the best thing that you can do for them. I probably should have turned on Fearful Impact here. It's something that ends up helping them a fair bit. So, yeah, this guy's got the Stasis Blade. Go to Fearful Impact. Despite what some folks have actually gone and posted about this, uh, even though many people seem to think that Fearful Impact is not parryable, it definitely is. I've seen it parried before, so just bear that in mind. It can still be parried, but that's really the main defense you've got going for it. You're still essentially getting, if somebody has, let's say, rank 1 of parry, I believe that's still a 95% chance to hit. I believe it's 5% per rank of parry, but I could be a little bit wrong with that. So these guys at the moment are fighting at rank 1 of basically everything, so that's another thing to bear in mind here. You would normally have their upgraded skills by this point, but they're finally able to do their job. What can I say? So these are going to be fantastic for breaking through armor due to their weapon selection. Actually, if you have some phalanxes that are locking up some heavy units, you can potentially get a lot of damage past heavy armor on multiple units at once, like I mentioned earlier. So again, you can do some really good stuff with these guys. So I think they're one of the ones that have gotten the strongest improvement in One Vision. They've gotten very, very tough, as you can see here. They've been able to keep this front line going for quite a while, despite starting to get a little bit overwhelmed here. They can essentially just, well, completely overwhelm past most healing things if you end up getting them going right. And they're actually slightly faster than Knights, I believe, so they're doing a pretty good job of actually keeping up with these guys. And alright, so I think that about covers everything I was hoping to cover on these guys. Once again, it's good to have the ability to actually hire Umbra units earlier on, so you can actually get a chance to see what they do. It's again very odd that they decided to put so many of these guys around with no ability to actually hire them. If you don't know what I'm talking about, it would be ones like these, where you've got your sort of ogre-looking guys and you've got your gremlins. You weren't able to hire them until late game before, so either way, there isn't a whole lot too special about those units. It's just another variant that you can potentially use. I believe they've got slightly higher stats as far as intelligence goes, but I could be incorrect on that one. At any rate, thank you for watching. I hope this was enjoyable, and I will see you another time. Have a good one.